my background has been very much in town planning, women and planning issues, planning for inclusion and for disability and accessibility. And I've been battling on for years about toilets, because toilets are very important, particularly to women, in terms of being able to get into cities, to go to work, go to school, to carry out their lives. But as a colleague coined the phrase, the bladder's leash, it's rather like you're a goat on the end of a rope and you're sort of at a stake in the middle and you can't go too far because you don't know where the toilets are going to be. And this affects particularly elderly people, but it increasingly affects all sorts of people, and you find that people plan their routes according to where the toilets are going to be. So I'm fighting on several fronts here, because toilet provision as a whole, particularly public toilet provision, has been in decline, because about 40% of them have declined in the last 10 years. And now we find that those that still exist are gradually being converted surreptitiously to gender-neutral toilets or toilets for anyone. But actually, if you look at toilet provision as a whole, you'll always find that women have about half the level of provision as men. And if you have a mirror image floor space, men always have more provision because you can get more urinals in than cubicles. And I had a trip downstairs just to check. And downstairs you've got, in the gents, 4 urinals and 1 cubicle, and in the ladies you've got 3 cubicles. That's not quite a 2-to-1 ratio, but it's fairly typical. And in many areas you'll find that there are far more urinals. So men have got more places to pee than women. And for years and years we've gone on about this. And this is a human rights issue, it's an equality issue, it's a public sector equality duty issue, and nobody's taken a blind bit of interest. I myself have been very active in this. I've done a lot of research with various colleagues on toilet provision, tons and tons of research funded by various bodies such as the EPSRC and the SRC and Nuffield, if any of you academic know about these things. And also, gradually, I got onto the British Standards Institute Committee BS 6465 on sanitary installations, which you probably have never heard of, but it's a very important committee because it sets the standards of provision for toilets. And particularly, it comes in 4 parts. Part 1 in particular is all about the levels and ratios of provision in relation to men and women, and also issues about where toilets are located. And it's not just public toilets, it's workplace toilets as well. Toilets in cinemas and theatres and offices and shops and factories and schools and everywhere. And we've been fighting quite a battle on this, because myself and a couple of other women are now on this committee. And for donkey's years it was just men, boring old sanitary engineer type men. And therefore written into the standards and condoned by law for years and years, men had more provision than women, and this was seen as normal because the man was the working man and the woman was meant to stay at home and all this rubbish. But the problem is we have greatly improved and upgraded the standards to provide better facilities for women at a higher level, but these standards are not retrospective. They only are affected when and if a building is substantially renovated, or whether there's been a new building. But in the meanwhile, to my horror, and I think this crept up on me, I've realised gradually that we've got nowhere in getting more provision for women, and even when men have got vastly excessive amounts of provision and we've said, well, let's move the wall and redesign it so when women get more facilities, nobody's taken a blind bit of notice. And suddenly heaven and earth is being moved to accommodate what is actually only 1% of the population, the teeny-weeny group of percentage of the population of people who are non-binary or trans or whatever you want to say, who have been very, very effective in terms of getting their viewpoint across. And yet very often with very, very negative, very minor levels of actual solid research, which I find astonishing, that all this rubbish on Twitter, people throwing out all these comments with no substantiation whatever, whereas we've spent years and years literally interviewing hundreds of people of all sorts of age groups on their toilet habits and their toilet needs, and just ignored. So this is a very extraordinary thing. But then people saying, oh, you're being transphobic, condemning trans people about this. And I'm saying, well, the trans people, very teeny percentage, are almost like a tiny little platform from which all this has developed. Because with the gender neutral toilets, or just relabelling the toilets for everyone. This, in fact, regardless of the Gender Recognition Act or any other self-identity things, it's in fact already letting in all and any type of men if they want to use the ladies' toilet. So it's gone way, way beyond the trans thing. And I think that the trans issue has almost been used as an excuse by some local authorities and toilet providers as a way of actually cutting costs. Bearing in mind that a lot of these toilet providers are entirely male-dominated, they haven't got a clue about women's toilets, and they say, oh, well, look at the queues for the ladies. Women are always complaining about the queues. Well, let's make all the toilets gender neutral. So they seem to think in doing that, they're solving the problem. The reality is that women have got far less provision to start with, and if the men join the queue, they're going to have even longer queues and less access to the cubicles, whereas women cannot use the gents' toilet normally, because most of these gents' toilets are mainly urinals, maybe with a couple of cubicles, usually with the doors off. And my friend Joanne Bichard, one of the other main toilet researchers, very important name, Joanne Bichard, she's done an awful lot of research, gone into pub toilets and all sorts of toilets, and she obviously has no sense of smell, because she goes into terrible male territories, and the idea that, oh, well, women can use these toilets and then it's all going to be equal, it's just, I think that really gets me, because as I said, my background's in architecture and surveying and town planning. The thing that really gets me about this is the incredible ignorance of the people that say that in terms of architectural design. There is no spatial awareness. There's no, as somebody said, they're floating in a spaceless vacuum. They've got no idea about numbers of things. There's no quantitative statistical research in terms of what the levels of provision are and who needs what. And also, to me, it all seems terribly self-centred, because when I look at toilets, in our research, we've always found that we're dealing with all sorts of different groups in society, and complete strangers have to share toilets with people they don't know and they might not like, so they're actually contested spaces. And you've got all sorts of people. You've got elderly people, young people, people with small children, disabled people, and also it's all sorts of issues about the sort of geographical location of toilets. This idea, oh, we just de-gender all the toilets. If you think, for example, some toilets, public toilets in particular, they're down really sort of grotty back streets, no lighting, in underpasses, and you just imagine sort of groups of young males out for a laugh, you know, weeing all over the place, and now they're meant to be sharing with women, and women who would be very wary already of going into some of these toilets. And I find it particularly interesting that it seems to be universities and arts centres where this is particularly caught on. Every university's now got to have its own gender-neutral toilet. And Bone Novak and a few of other colleagues came up to the University of the West of England to look at the toilets in the Students' Union block, where they've now got toilets with a sign on the door, ladies and women's and men's sign, but you go in and it's simply a whole row of cubicles with spaces underneath, and no separation whatsoever. And I imagine that on a sort of boozy sort of Saturday night at the Students' Union. I think it's absolutely incredible. But fortunately there are other toilets, for those that know, which are still separated. But I think this brings up the issue of what is a gender-neutral toilet, which seems to be the latest phrase. I mean, it's a bit like that comment about the bishop. He went to this conference and they said, oh, the GNTs are downstairs. And he said, oh, don't mind if I do, because he was thinking of gin and tonics. But in fact, gender-neutral toilets are spreading like the plague. Oh, not a very good joke. In any case, so if anybody offers you a GNT, it is not a drink, it's a toilet. That's what I have to remember. But in any case, there's two types of gender-neutral toilets. The ones that are self-contained, specially purpose-built, with walls down to the floor and often with wash basins inside. And these are actually not so bad, and they're rather like the old type of unisex toilet. And particularly in some new facilities, new schools, new arts centres, sometimes these are built, a bit of money and thought's gone into it, and it's perhaps not so bad that anybody could use them, and it's very convenient if you've got a sort of corner of the building where it's quite a walk to the nearest toilets. But on the other hand, the other way of doing it is just slapping a label on and saying we're not going to call them ladies and gents anymore, we're going to call them gender neutral or toilets for everyone. And you go inside some of these toilets, and again they've got these massive spaces under the walls and under the doors. The soundproofing is non-existent. The shared facilities in terms of the basins, washing facilities. Now, I often get the comment from some people, silly little boys on Twitter. I've recently, as you know, about 3 weeks ago, Danielle got me into Twitter, which I've never done before, because I've gone off it again because life is too busy, and I don't want to know what these Scottish little boys are saying in their bedrooms. I'm not interested. But in any case, often if you say, well, what's the problem with gender-neutral toilets? They'll say, oh, well, there's no problem because everybody shares their toilets at home in their bathroom. And so, as an elderly friend of mine back in Portishead said the other day, she said, well, we don't share these toilets with strangers. And also, if you go into your bathroom, you don't have a row of cubicles. You've probably got one toilet, or you might even have a separate toilet separate from your bathroom. So you're not letting anybody and everybody in. And secondly, people often say, men-type people often say, well, what's the problem? You just lock the door in the cubicle and then it doesn't matter what happens. Well, the reality is there's still noise and smells, and people get very embarrassed. Women get very embarrassed moving their bowels next door to a man. And also some men, they get what's called piss shy. There's a Latin word for this. There's always Latin words for these things. But they basically can't go because they get incredibly embarrassed. It's about 10% of the population, apparently. Pararesis, I think that's the Latin word for it. Every one of these toilet diseases, bladder and bladder things, have always got wonderful Latin names, and there's also always an ordinary sort of vernacular colloquial name that people have. So there's a bit of a sort of lack of communication between professional people and ordinary people, as is the case. But in any case, if you go into a toilet, it's not, particularly for women, it's not just a matter of going into the cubicle. There's the access space, the space where the wash basins are, where you queue, where you wait, etc. And women have often said to me that they're very concerned about using the cubicle, using the wash basins, or standing around. If you've got other men, because you know some men tend to hang around in toilets, we all know this. And a friend of mine who worked for the Toilet Authority in North Wales, she said, always take a walkie-talkie with you and start talking into it, make a bit of noise, and then the men that are hanging around, they'll all just sort of scarper back into the washes, you see. So I thought that's a handy thing to know. Because if you're doing toilet research, you've got to go into these toilet jungles and really deal with it. But in any case, coming back to the seriousness of it, a lot of women are very concerned when they're menstruating, and particularly younger women get terribly embarrassed about it if they're sharing toilets with men and perhaps the plug doesn't pull, the flush doesn't work, and they're left with a bit plop of menses in the bowl or whatever, and they think, well, it's just so awkward, then you've got to dispose of your sanitary towel or tampon or whatever. And also, as many women have said to me, some women tend to have sort of accidents, shall we say, suddenly they don't realise they've suddenly started menstruating because it's the wrong time of the month or something's happened. Then, often you will find in women's toilets, women think, oh, we've got to wash our knickers out, or we've got to get rid of this stain. And you can't really do that in front of men using the wash basin. And then another woman, this is somebody called Nikki Nukes, she said to me, and other people have said this as well, if you're using one of these moon cups, which is very environmental, you're meant to wash it out. And that's another thing that you've got to do in the wash basin. And would you be able to do that in front of a load of men? Now, some women got a bit jokey about this and said, well, the way to keep the men out is just sort of daub the walls with menstrual blood. Then they'll all vanish. I'm not quite sure that's the answer. But in any case, just to get to the end of this, because I've got the times ticking on, there's 1 minute and 30 seconds. Well, two other things. Also, people with disabilities, making the disabled toilets for everyone is a huge problem, because then that means they have to join the queue and they can't use any other toilet. And then just to finish, in England it's all gone to pot literally, but the United Nations, under the SDG 6, which is the Sustainable Development Goal, within that there's a whole load of documents and statements to the effect that women and men, in particular girls and boys in schools, should not share toilets. This is particularly relevant in some of the developing countries, where girls don't carry on at school when they start menstruating. Women can't go to work because there's no toilets at work, or they're meant to share them with men, or there's no washing facilities, nothing to do with menstruating. And we always say, oh, this is a problem that happens in Africa or whatever, But the reality is that there's a whole lot of lessons to learn from this. And I have taken this up with the minister, And she said, this SDG 6 doesn't apply to Britain. And I said, well, all the others do.
Yeah.
All the environmental ones do. They knock themselves out, crazy on all this environmental sustainability stuff. But this is the SDG 6, which is all about sanitation and water, and with all these social issues, is just as valid. So I think something really strange is going on. And in terms of trying to claw back, the things that have been lost, I mean, I'm doing my little bit on the British standards, and other people are as well. But I mean, as I said, it's gone way, way beyond the Gender Recognition Act. I think this has just been used as an excuse, a door to basically clobber women left, right, and centre. So we've got to reclaim our toilets.